You're watching the Catechized Life with Higher Things. Let's talk about the fifth commandment, that fifth commandment that protects our gift of life. In fact, we've talked over the last several episodes that God's commandments are these divine fences that keep us from doing stupid stuff to ourselves and others. It is a way of God protecting us from our sinful nature as He prohibits and says, "Thou shalt not." But as we know, our sinful nature likes to wreak havoc and have its way. And in fact, what often happens is the evil one, he tempts our neighbor to sin against us. And then when we're sinned against, we find ourselves brewing over that sin, wounded by that sin, hurting by that sin. And then this sin against us has a way of stirring us up. And we find ourselves imagining or even recalling all the different times where we have been wounded and hurt against by this other individual. And then this sin begins to take root in ourselves, where we find ourselves trying to justify ourselves, playing the victim card, that rage and that anger brewing within us. And the next thing you know, we find ourselves slandering that individual that wounded us in the first place. And then around and around that goes, and we continue to find ourselves getting frustrated even more to the point where, yes, hatred sets in, and that, my friends, is the beginning of breaking that fifth commandment. Indeed, at the root of the fifth commandment is this hatred for our fellow mankind, not wishing good upon them, but having character assassination and also this brewing hatred which would want to eliminate, to end their life for their sinning against us. This is exactly what the fifth commandment seeks to prohibit. It prevents us from doing bodily harm to our neighbor. It prevents us from this assassination of their character. That's even the eighth commandment, as we'll get to later on. But more importantly, it exposes and shows us this root of bitterness that can take root in us as we find ourselves being angry and lashing out in this hatred towards our neighbor. And indeed, like all the other commandments, this fifth commandment then exposes that root of sin. It exposes our hatred for our neighbor who we should love and support and uplift, even when we're slapped on the one cheek, to turn our other cheek and to turn back in love towards them. But it exposes our sinfulness. It exposes our need for vengeance. It exposes that we want to be God and in control of everything and enact vengeance on our neighbor. It exposes our great need as sinners, just like those that sin against us. It exposes us as sinners in need of God's grace. And thus, these 10 commandments are so good, for they not only protect us from doing stupid stuff to ourselves and others, but they also drive us to understand our sin, our malady. And when we understand our sin and malady, we see our need for a Savior. And thus, the 10 commandments, they lead us to Jesus. They lead us to confession. They lead us to hear the absolution. And it leads us to show the darkness of our own heart and to hear the forgiveness of Christ. You've been watching the Catechized Life with Higher Things.